September 15th, 2009. Police are called to an incident at Coral Gables High School, south of Miami, Florida.
It's not every day that somebody's dying in a high school, especially at Coral Gables Senior.
This was something that resonated with the entire county, that a homicide would take place on the grounds of the school in the middle of classes.
On arrival, police are presented with a vicious and bloody crime scene.
To actually stab somebody and get the feeling of that thing going through somebody as they're dying literally and bleeding out, it's a very violent attack. Well, he did that 5 times.
To stab somebody 5 times, you got to be mad at him.
Investigators quickly identify a suspect, but were struggling to understand their motive.
Race, ethnicity, socio-economic background had nothing to do with this. This was as simple as a young kid who didn't know how to act or how to deal with his feelings, who decided that the best way to go about it was to put a knife in his pocket that day and start a fight.
This is the story of Andy Rodriguez and how a simple friendship drove him to change from a student with his life ahead of him into a cold-blooded killer. It's the morning of September 15th, 2009. Police receive a 911 call from Coral Gables High School.
I had just left the office and I was en route to do something on one of my cases when I got a telephone call from Sergeant Brassey. He asked me to respond to Coral Gables Senior.
I was driving south on Segovia Street when the call went out. I started going towards the call, which was a fight in progress. Later, they put it out that somebody had been stabbed.
I arrived at the scene shortly after 10 in the morning at Coral Gables Senior.
When the police first arrive, they are confronted with a chaotic scene.
I remember just trying to navigate through all the cars that were there and the presence of media on the scene. I remember students on the outside of the school. I remember parents, what appeared to me, possibly trying to pick up their kids or trying to locate their kids.
Parents had been called. We know that parents had responded to the school in an attempt to contact their children.
This is very much out of keeping for the quiet, well-to-do part of town.
Coral Gables is very nice, very diverse with people. It's kind of more of a middle to higher income families.
It's sort of like the Beverly Hills of Miami-Dade County. So when you say, oh, I live in Coral Gables, it's like, you're very fancy. You're like, whoa, But, there are areas that are, a little more humble. There's a lot of apartment buildings and sort of young families. Like Miami, the movers and shakers in Coral Gables are generally Cuban Americans, people whose families have been here now for a few generations and have really made their money and their wealth as doctors, lawyers, developers, people who are ingrained in the power structure of the county.
Crime is, you get your typical kind of car burglaries, kind of thefts, but nothing really, major happens there.
And in the heart of this historic town is the equally historic high school.
Coral Gables Senior High School is one of a handful of very well-known, important legacy high schools in Dade County. A lot of famous people have gone to school there, a lot of, just a lot of the community. It's an old school, so there's a lot of people who have gone through there.
Members of Congress went there. Janet Reno went there, former Attorney General of the United States of America. This is a place that, people know locally.
Having made their way through the gathering crowds, detectives head for the crime scene to begin a full investigation into what has happened at Coral Gables High School.
I walked into the school. I remember it was a courtyard area inside the school.
The positioning of the body that I recall was that the victim was found face down on the concrete floor. And by this point, I had learned that it was a stabbing and that we did know that the victim had been stabbed multiple times. At the time, it was early in the morning, so the student activity was cordoned off from that location, with the exception of people who may have witnessed the incident. And of course, they were removed from the scene and isolated or relocated to an area where detectives could speak with them.
There There was a number of students that needed to be interviewed. They had all been separated, and they were in different parts of the school, mostly in the office area, but they were all separated in different rooms, so they can't tarnish each other's perspectives or what they witnessed on the case. They don't speak to each other. So I methodically just started going one by one. I talked to each student, I did interviews, and ultimately I took formal statements on them, each one.
As detectives are interviewing the witnesses, a clearer picture of what happened begins to emerge.
They all had their different twists, but they were all consistent in that these were all students that are walking through the hallways between classes. And you can go back to the days when you were in school, how chaotic the hallways were sometimes. Not in a bad way, just people screaming, people meeting, people socializing. So people's perspectives are going to be very different, and what they witnessed is going to be very different. So I got a lot of different versions of, I was walking through the hallway, I was going to my next class, I heard a commotion, I turned, I see two students fighting, and I see one of them collapse to the floor. I saw blood coming from his chest, or I saw blood coming from his back. So it was a variation of that story from different perspectives of the students who were walking through. Some of the kids, I remember one in particular that requested to have one of his parents present during the interview, which of course we agreed to. The other ones were some were shaken up. You can see visibly they were very shaken up.
The students were really, really affected by it. I remember the testimony of several of the witness students afterwards, how they still carried this very traumatic incident that they saw unfold in front of them in the hallway of a school, how it traumatized their life.
And a couple of them were, pretty matter of fact. So some of these kids they'll surprise you sometimes with the way they react to things.
While the crime scene investigators are conducting their portion of the investigation, I'm looking at the crime scene, I'm looking at the victim just to document what he or she might be wearing. I will go discuss investigations with the crime scene investigators on the scene. Did you see anything unusual? Did you notice any type of defense wounds on the victim, something that I may have missed? I recall seeing that the victim did have some defense cuts on his hands, and I do remember seeing stab wounds to the victim's chest. In addition to the stab wounds, I saw trauma to the face, and just at that particular time attributed it to the victim falling face first on the ground.
Investigators are gathering a lot of evidence, but are still missing some crucial information.
Most unfortunately, what caught everybody's attention to the fight in the first place was the noise and the commotion. By that time, the fight's already started, so nobody was really able to tell us at what point it started or who started it, only that a fight had started and that it ended the way it did. That was what was consistent. What we couldn't get at that point was the motive for the fight, because everybody's attention was called because of the commotion or the noise once the fight had already started. Another thing that was consistent was that no words were exchanged during the fight. Nobody reported that the victim said anything. Nobody reported that the subject said anything. It was just, by the time their attention was drawn to the fight, it was already the fight was already ongoing and no words were exchanged.
Another breakthrough comes when they scan through the school's security tapes.
At some point, it becomes known to us that there's cameras at the school. Now it's actually normal for all schools to have cameras. Back then it wasn't so routine, but this school had cameras. So one of the things I was asked to do at the school was to review the footage and to get a copy of that tape. And we did. And from the tape, you don't see the whole fight, but you see part of the fight.
The security cameras were in the courtyard, and what they showed was a fight broke out in the hallway, and the fight then spilled out into the courtyard. And you do see a fight. It's very quick. It lasts maybe a minute. And you can then see him, there's cameras throughout the school, so you can then see him running through the hallways and is covering his head with his shirt. So clearly fleeing from the scene. You can see a girl who must be, 5 feet away from what's happening? And I think you can look at the facial features. I'm not sure she really registered what was happening right away.
With witnesses' statements and the security cameras footage, police quickly identify a suspect.
It appeared that the aggressor was going to be the subject. He ends up on top of the victim at one point. He ends up with an object in his hand. People report that the victim was bleeding profusely, that the victim at one point lost consciousness. And a couple of the students mentioned by the first name. They mentioned the name Andy. They don't know his last name. They've seen him around school. And that's when I made the decision, as I'm talking to these people, that let's get this guy's photograph real quick. So while I'm in the office, I asked the administration, can I get a yearbook from the year before? And I research his name, and I see the page that has his photo on it. So I made several copies of that album. And as I began speaking to the students, I started presenting that page from the yearbook that has multiple students on it. And I said, look at this page. Tell me if you see anybody on that page that you recognize. And each one by one, said, this guy right here, he's the one that got into the fight. This is the guy that had the object in his hand. And one by one, they began to identify Andy Rodriguez as a person who fought the victim.
September 15th, 2009. Police are continuing at high speed in their investigation into the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
This is really a simple, straightforward case that doesn't reflect the nature of the crime that was committed.
This was the kind of case that is really a dumb high school fight that probably happens a gazillion times every single day across the country.
It's becoming clear that the prime suspect for the killing is student Andy Rodriguez.
A couple of the students I interviewed saw an object in Andy Rodriguez's hand, and that they saw severe injuries to the victim's chest or back area where he was bleeding profusely. Ultimately, he lost balance and he fell face first on the ground.
A quiet teenager, investigators learn Rodriguez spent little of his social time outside of his girlfriend, Neese Salgado.
In that summer of 2009, Neese Salgado was going out with Andy Rodriguez. They were steady, so to speak. During that time, Andy had become very jealous of Neese's, not knowing whether or not she was speaking to other boys at the time.
Apparently, Andy and Neese had actually broken up, and the reason was that he had wanted her MySpace password, and she didn't want to give it to him, right? And so it was this, this friction point between them that sort of set the tone for this possessiveness that Andy had over her.
That breakup takes them into the new school year, but they get back together in the first 2 weeks of school.
Similarly quiet was the life of Juan Carlos Rivera, who had recently moved to Miami from Cuba.
Juan Carlos Rivera was a young man of a Cuban family. His parents were both doctors in Cuba. His parents were divorced. His father then moved to Spain, where he was practicing in Spain. When Juan Carlos came of age for Cuban military, his mother decided she wasn't interested in having him partake in that and was looking for a suitable alternative to that. That suitable alternative for them was for him to move to Spain with his father. He spent some time in Spain with his father and didn't really take kindly to the life in Spain. And at that point in time, a family decision was made that he would move to Miami and live with his uncle and with his grandmother.
Juan's experience was very typical of what a lot of people who are coming from another country to Miami experience, because there's a huge difference culturally between the Cuban Americans who have been born here and whose families have been here for generations, and they all speak English, and they sort of have that Miami American, Cuban American culture, and the people who came within the last few years. So there's this huge culture divide, and even within the high school students. You get a lot of Cuban American kids who kind of look down on the more recent arrivals. And they call them, and it's an offensive slang, but they call them refs, or they call them refie, right? Which is just slang for a refugee, right? And it's a way, and every immigrant group historically has had sort of these culture clashes with the people who have been here for a while, and they're just fresh off the boat kind of thing. And Juan sort of fit that bill, right? He's someone who just came over. He was someone that sort of was this sad kind of figure trying to make his way into this whole new society, and societies within societies, right? High school, this is, you have your different cliques and your different power structures even within a school, let alone within a whole community.
Juan Carlos is now living with his uncle and grandmother in the same apartment block as Neese Salgado.
So in this area of Coral Gables, he was living in a 2-story apartment building. much like the very old style where the doors face out. And he would see Neese Salgado. They never really spoke to each other, but they saw each other and they knew of each other from seeing each other in the apartment complex. On the first day of school, Juan Carlos went to the bus stop where he was going to take the metro bus, public transportation, to school, because he had no other way of getting to school because of the socioeconomic conditions that he was living in at that point in time.
It's not a comfortable experience to take public transportation in Miami, and it instantly marks you as someone that doesn't have the means. You know, we're in Miami, whether we actually have the means or not, a lot of it is about image, right? It's about, you know, I can have my nice car to get me from, you know, Kendall to, you know, South Beach. And so if you don't have a car and you're taking public transportation, especially in a place that can be as starkly divided and judgy as Coral Gables, you know, you're the kid taking the bus to school, you know, you're lower class in the eyes of many.
She saw him there wearing his red shirt, his Coral Gables High School shirt, and she pulled over and she rolled down the window and asked him if he needed a ride to school, having seen him around the complex before. And he, of course, took that opportunity to go take a ride with Neese. One, she was an attractive young lady, and two, he needed a ride to school and he didn't want to ride the metro bus.
The previously sweet relationship takes a nasty turn when the green-eyed monster is revealed within Rodriguez.
Andy has seen that Neese and Juan Carlos Rivera are arriving at school together for those first 2 weeks. He's not appreciative of this, and now that they're back together, he has asked her to stop. And she does. She stops giving Juan Carlos a ride to school. But she doesn't stop speaking to Juan Carlos. So when she sees him inside the cafeteria, they're nice to each other, they speak to each other, they have conversation. And again, these are more issues of jealousy for Andy Rodriguez. There was never any conversation, and there was never a statement given by anybody that showed that Juan Carlos Rivera had any romantic intentions towards Neese Salgado.
Investigators are beginning to understand the motive behind the attack and start a manhunt for Andy Rodriguez, who is on the run.
Students initially say he ran across the street from the school, and then residents from that neighborhood called the police and reported seeing a young white male running through the front yards of the residences and gave a description of the clothing, which matched the description of the clothing of the student who fled the scene, and units responded to the area.
I was training somebody, we were just driving, we heard the call go out, so we said, you know, we started heading toward that direction. As the information kept coming over the radio, we heard that he was running across to Riviera. As soon as we turned onto Riviera, we saw a young, male running through the front yards of that street. Officer Bueno then kind of approached him and kind of cut him off, and he ended up in somebody's yard. We exited the vehicle, and Officer Bueno gave him commands to get on the ground, put his hands behind his back. He then went up to him, handcuffed him and searched him, at which time he did find the knife. He then gave it to me. I secured it into a container to preserve it, and then we put him in the back of my car at that time.
Investigators now start pulling background checks and information on Andy Rodriguez.
So when Andy Rodriguez was brought into the Dade County Jail, the public defender said that he had never been arrested, he had no prior record, which was true. He had no prior criminal record. But at his school, he did have a fairly lengthy disciplinary record. I think there were 7 instances of discipline having been levied against him. So he clearly had some issues at the school and definitely was someone who had been known to have issues there.
September 15th, 2009. Police investigating the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera quickly apprehend their #1 suspect, Andy Rodriguez.
It's right before noon, so it's been almost 4 hours since the actual murder has taken place.
From beginning to end, it really is open and shut in a number of hours.
With Andy in custody, investigators have to start the delicate task of interviewing him with the hope of securing a confession.
My wheels are turning. I have to be on point. I want to make sure I do a good job translating. I could ruin the interview. I could ruin a case by not translating correctly, by handling something improperly. So I'm getting myself ready for the long haul. I know it's going to be probably a long interview. I'm going to be in there for a while, and I want to make sure my head's on straight. The subject's already in custody. He's in one of the interview rooms waiting to be interviewed. I remember walking in, and I was struck by how young he looked. You handle these cases, and over the years, you You're used to dealing with certain segment of the population, more rugged. A lot of times, the drug dealers or the, people that aren't the law-abiding citizens in our society. But you walk into this one, it's a kid, it's a student. This kid should have been in class at that time. He should have been maybe at lunch, but he's sitting here in an interview room in the homicide bureau because we believe he killed somebody, so we need to find out what happened. We go in and he begins to tell us a story of what occurred. And he tells us that the day before, he was walking in the hallways of Coral Gables Senior when he accidentally bumped into the victim while walking to class.
Yo iba para la clase.
I was walking to my class.
Y él iba para la suya, me imagino.
And I imagine he was going to his class.
Cuando fui entrando al pasillo, él iba saliendo.
When I was entering the hallway, he was exiting.
Chocamos.
And we bumped into each other. And that he told the victim something along the lines of, hey, watch out or be careful. And the victim kind of stared him down.
When he bumped into you yesterday, did you say anything to him?
Cuando él chocó con usted ayer, ¿usted le dijo algo a él?
Yes.
Yes.
What did you say?
¿Qué le dijo?
Ten cuidado.
Be careful.
Did you mean that in a threat in any way?
¿Usted lo dijo de una manera como amenazándolo?
No. Mine, yo le digo, what's up?
I said it normal. Then the day of the murder, September 15th, he says, again, they're exchanging classes, and he was on his way to weightlifting class, when he says that he's about to pass the victim in the hallway, and he observes the victim kind of stick his elbow out, like to kind of bump him a little bit. So he, in return, also sticks his elbow out and bumps the victim. And at this time, he says the victim squared off to him, and the fight ensued. But at some point during the fight, the way he describes it is that he ends up in a disadvantage because the victim somehow ends up behind him, choking him out. And it's at this point that he feels the only way he's going to be able to save himself is to reach into his pocket and pull out a knife that he found a couple days earlier when he got off the bus. And he takes that knife and somehow, in the frenzy, ends up stabbing the victim one time, is able to break free. And at this point, he runs from the area because he doesn't know if the victim's going to continue hurting him. And he runs to the residential area where he's eventually located by police, and that's where he surrenders.
He gives a statement where he believes that this was self-defense, that he believed Juan Carlos Rivera was going to do something to him at some point. Honestly, I think it was just an explanation that Andy Rodriguez gave that really had no merit. But at that point in time, he really just needed to give himself an out for what he'd done.
The way he described it, it was literally just bumping into each other the day before, bumping into each other the day of, and escalating into a fight. And he says he never had problems with the victim before, never knew the victim.
Mr. Rodriguez is very clear. He says, I didn't even know the guy. Didn't even know his name.
The person you had the fight at school with today,
La persona con la que tuvo la pelea en colegio hoy.
Do you know his name?
¿Usted sabe su nombre? No.
While Andy Rodriguez is giving his version of events, other witnesses are telling investigators the whole story that unfolded over the previous few days.
There's multiple detectives that are doing multiple interviews while you're interviewing the subject. So you're constantly getting information in. And every time you take a break, there's a detective or somebody updating you on something else that they learned. And now we're learning that people have already interviewed the subject's girlfriend and other students at the school who are now describing, hold on a second, this isn't a bumping kind of thing.
In the time before the homicide, Andy will see Juan Carlos in the hall on a number of occasions. And during those occasions, he will attempt to intimidate Juan Carlos. He'll bump him, he'll say things to him in the hallway. On September 14th of 2009, the day before the homicide, he'll actually tell him to be careful and to watch out for himself.
In fact, we're now learning from additional interviews as the day goes on that some of Andy Rodriguez's friends had already confronted Juan Rivera days and weeks prior and had words with him. Basically, they were almost like bullying him because they knew that Andy was jealous because his girlfriend was giving the victim rides to school, and that was creating problems between them. And that's the reason why Andy didn't like Juan Carlos Rivera.
In that intervening week prior to the murder, Juan Carlos Rivera sees Neese Salgado at school often, and they converse, and they're congenial with one another. But Andy Rodriguez becomes increasingly jealous. He purchases a knife. The knife is a stiletto-type knife where the blade is in the handle and it ejects when a button is pressed.
There were a lot of questions as to where the knife came from. The girlfriend claimed that they had purchased it at a flea market, and the idea was that he worked at another flea market so that he needed it for his job when he was breaking down boxes. Rodriguez claims the knife came from, he found it walking home from school one day and just saw a knife and just kept it.
He says that the morning of the murder, that he put it in his pocket in the event that he had any problems with the victim because they had bumped into each other in the hallway the day before. To me, it was very evident, whether he realized it or not, that the jealousy that he had was brewing to a point where he wanted something to happen. He was waiting for that confrontation to happen, and he was going to make it happen on September 15th.
What is clear, both from the visual evidence we have from the surveillance footage and then from the eyewitnesses who testified in open court, that Mr. Rivera was fighting for his life. And you can see this, and he was stabbed 5 times. And as a matter of fact, was fighting up till the point when the assailant ran away. And then he collapsed and passed away soon thereafter.
So now we get this information. We want to find out what Andy Rodriguez has to say about this now. So we go back in there now and we confront him with these newfound facts. So there's new information we're getting, and we ask him about it. Andy Rodriguez says, you know what? Yeah, it's true. I didn't want to tell you anything because I didn't want to get my girlfriend involved in what happened, but let me explain to you what happened. And he begins to tell us basically the same story. And he tells us that he was dating his girlfriend, and that at some point on the first day of school, he saw his girlfriend driving the victim to school. Well, he ain't like that. Even though he reports he wasn't jealous.
The incident that happened yesterday and today with you and him, did that have anything to do with your girlfriend?
El incidente que pasó ayer y hoy no tuvo nada que ver con tu novia.
No, ya se va temprano.
Any jealousy on your part?
¿Tú estabas celoso?
No, estás loco.
So are you crazy? I'm not gonna be jealous.
No.
In a young 17-year-old's mind, he may not even realize he was jealous. He felt uncomfortable with it, or he didn't like the fact that she was driving another boy to school. And and he kept bottling it up, and he kept dealing with it the way he did, and then ended up all, obviously, erupting the way it did.
Andy told a number of lies in that statement. He told so many that it was really easy for us as prosecutors to call him out on those, and to make a jury see that anything that he had said in that statement really was to just get himself out of trouble.
When the interview comes to an end, police are sure that they have the murderer and his motive for doing so.
At the end of the day, Andy Rodriguez killed Juan Carlos Rivera over a jealous rage that he had over a relationship that he believed Juan Carlos was having with his girlfriend at the time, Neese Salgado, which never actually existed.
It was something that seemed so teenage, and yet it escalated into this, knife in someone's heart, and this lost life, and these lives that were shattered. And that was the really tragic thing.
The friends, they couldn't give a lot of detail, but they knew that the issue stemmed from Andy Rodriguez not liking the victim because of the rides to school and the relationship that he had, or Andy thought he had, with his girlfriend. So it was definitely over jealousy issues. They just didn't know how to put it into words sometimes, and they'll tell you a 1-hour story, and at the end of the day, when you look at the stories, he was jealous, and that's all it came down to.
This wasn't a whodunit. This wasn't a case where we had to figure out, did he really do it? Did he have an alibi? It wasn't like these traditional murder mysteries that we all see on TV and in the news. It really boiled down to that raw human emotion of jealousy, of insecurity, of disrespect, these sort of things that pop up when we're young that we often, that usually just get settled in, fights or arguments or a fist fight at worst, but very rarely escalate into this very public killing.
From this point on, later that afternoon, Andy Rodriguez was booked and charged with murder after conferring with the state attorney's office. And now the case continues as far as continuing to do interviews. More students come forth after the fact. We were able to watch the news that night like everybody else, and we see students being interviewed by the media. Those are students we have to track down now because we know of them initially, and we want to see what their story is or what they witnessed the day of. So now that's got to take days. Sometimes it takes weeks and months to track all these people down. You want to do interviews with them. Some people actually didn't see anything. You find out a lot of these people that come on the news, they lie or they embellish or they exaggerate what they saw because they just want to come on the news. But some actually do have value to what they witnessed. And those people we want to bring in, and we're going to do the same thing we did with the other students. The day of, we're going to take a formal statement from them, and they become witnesses in the case. And all that information, eventually what it does is it creates a puzzle, because everybody has a different perspective of what they saw, and it fills in little gaps of the story that maybe somebody else didn't see. So that's why all these interviews are super important for us.
Detectives have one last big thing to do with the case.
The autopsy for us was very important because the autopsy tells you the story forensically and with the evidence what actually happened. People can describe a punch, people can describe what appears to be a stab wound or a plunge with a knife, but until you see the actual injuries on a human being, that doesn't lie. And that doesn't leave anything up for interpretation. It's clear. A stab wound's a stab wound, a bullet hole's a bullet hole, and in this case, we knew exactly where the stab wounds were located, which supported even more the fact that Andy Rodriguez was the aggressor and that Andy Rodriguez 100% had the upper hand in this fight, ultimately killing Juan Rivera. There was a total of 5 stab wounds. 3 were to the chest, 2 to the back. The ones that the victim suffered to the back, the way that Andy Rodriguez described, it would have been impossible for him to have done those stab wounds unless the victim would have been choking him from behind. He would have reached behind the victim somehow and been able to inflict those stab wounds. It's physically impossible. And that was one of the first things that we noticed in the autopsy that refuted or it was inconsistent with what he said to us during the interview, proving even more so how aggressive and how violent the attack was and what his mindset was when he confronted Juan Rivera at the school on September 15th. That basically ends there because there's really no follow-up anymore in this case. It's wrapped up in a couple days because we have the subject in custody, we have the murder weapon in our possession, we have sworn statements from everybody that account for the fighting and the background of what transpired and what led to the fight, and now we have the medical examiner's findings of exactly what the injuries are to the victim, which nobody can dispute anymore. You can't say I stabbed him one time when the victim has 5 stab wounds, or you can't argue about where you stabbed the victim when we have the evidence right there in front of us.
September 2009, Miami-Dade County Police are close to closing the investigation into the senseless murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
From the time that the homicide took place to the time that the interviews took place, it really wasn't a lot of time.
He was just a young kid who's trying to come up in the world and fit into this new, very, very have and have not society, and this is what happened.
Before investigators can go to trial, they have to gather all the evidence they have against the suspect, Andy Rodriguez.
So up to this point, we have student interviews that we did that witnessed the fight. We have students who saw Andy Rodriguez with an object in his hand and they see the victim bleeding profusely and falling to the ground. We have people who see him fleeing the school in a residential area, later on apprehended by Coral Gables PD. We have the murder weapon found on the victim with the victim's blood. We also have the victim's blood on Andy Rodriguez's clothing when he's taken into custody. And now we have Andy Rodriguez's own admission that he was involved in a fight, that he indeed inflicted these fatal wounds to the victim. He minimizes and he says, I only stabbed him one time. He tries to get around it. He tries to explain it in a way where he looks like the victim. But the evidence is overwhelming, especially once we go into the autopsy now. And now we see, well, it wasn't 1 stab wound, it was 5 stab wounds. And 3 were to the chest and 2 to the back that were impossible by the account that he gives us. That's more than enough evidence that we need. It's overwhelming evidence at this point for the prosecution to be able to go forth and try this case in a court of law.
The trial very quickly becomes a courtroom drama.
The defense attorney is a very animated, very aggressive, his name is Alex Michaels, very good defense lawyer.
He's like this Romanian guy with this very thick accent, and he always likes to needle people and go over the top with his arguments. So it becomes like there's a lot of tension in there because he's sort of grading the judge and grading the prosecutors and attacking the witnesses on the stand and through cross-examination. So it kind of just there's this tension that builds up throughout the whole thing.
The defense attorney, Alex Michaels, he began with a defense of self-defense, stating that Juan Carlos allegedly threatening Andy Rodriguez over this friendship and that he had with Neese Salgado. And then it progressed into Andy needing to defend himself because these elbowings in the hallway were really the product of Juan Carlos, as opposed to the truth, which was that they were actually because of Andy.
The defense didn't have a lot of cards to play in this case. I mean, you know, when the murder happens on camera and there are eyewitnesses, there's not a whole lot of cards you can play. So you've got to probably come up with some unique legal arguments to try to work on.
He came after us, and I think part of it was the evidence was overwhelming. And at this point, he's got to find some angle to try to explain why his client did what he did. A distraction, maybe, I don't know what you want to call it. They do that sometimes. They want to distract the jury. And obviously, you know, the facts spoke for themselves.
The opening statement was one that's very factual. It takes you through the events that happened that day, but more importantly lays out the foundation for why Andy would want to have this argument with Juan Carlos and ultimately murder him.
The crux of the case was not whether or not Mr. Rodriguez did this conduct. It was whether or not it was murder or whether or not it was in self-defense.
It wasn't self-defense because Andy had it in for Juan Carlos Rivera from the day that he met Juan Carlos Rivera. He knew that Juan Carlos Rivera was a possible interest for his girlfriend, and that set him off from the beginning. He didn't even want to see Juan Carlos Rivera anywhere near his girlfriend, and he would do anything to make sure that that never happened.
The incident that happened
When a defendant gives a lie like that it was self-defense to detectives, it kind of pigeonholes the defense into what they're going to tell the jury happened, because they can't really go with another defense. So in that way, Andy had already set up the defense or the failed defense for the trial way back when he was interviewed by detectives.
At the end of the day, when you have a case where the facts speak for themselves and it's so overwhelmingly against the defense has only a couple options left: to attack your integrity or attack your procedures. And that's what they do every single time.
The jury don't take long to convict Andy Rodriguez of the murder.
The trial was fairly cut and dry. The jury agreed. They took less than a day to convict him. They convicted him of second-degree murder.
It's a fairly quick deliberation. It really only took a couple of hours. I think they strongly took to heart everything that we said. They did consider probably the self-defense for a moment, but really paid it no mind at the end of the day, where he was found guilty within a couple of hours.
It was one of those that I thought would get played out to some reasonable numbers, but the strategy for the defense was to go to trial. My opinion is that he thought maybe that he would get sympathy from the jury because he was a young kid. You just gotta find that one person on that jury who says, I can't put this kid away for a long time. He's a young kid. But it was a very vicious attack and unnecessary, and I think that's what doomed him.
When it was all said and done, there was some speculation initially that he might be charged with first-degree murder. That did not happen. He was charged with second-degree murder, and the prosecutors were pushing for a lifetime in prison.
November 2011, Andy Rodriguez is sentenced for the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
The judge then had discretion as to the sentencing. The prosecutors wanted life in prison. They did not get it. The judge handed down a sentence of 40 years in prison and then 10 years of probation after he's released. That means that Mr. Rodriguez won't come out of jail until he's at least 51 years old. In the state of Florida, there's a law that says you have to serve at least 85% of your sentence, which means he won't come out until he's at least 51, and then he'll be under probation until he's at least 61. And the judge said that, Mr. Rodriguez, because of your actions, you have forfeited your youth and most of your life. And that's what happened to him.
I think the jury got it right. Yeah, I think the jury got it right. And I think the judge got it right. You know, Andy, if he serves the 85% of his sentence and all of that, he should get out in his early 50s. That's, you know, a significant amount of time behind bars. The world will be completely different than when he got in there. So, yeah, I think the jury got it right.
In this case, because of the evidence that was so obvious, it seems like justice was done. And the real tragedy here was the senseless loss of life on both sides. And the prosecutor, Catherine Fernandez Rundle, said after the judgment, after the sentencing, she said that the real tragedy here is not just for the Rivera family, but also for the Rodriguez family, that 2 lives were lost here. Yes, he took a life. Yes, that's depending on your faith belief. It's a mortal sin. It's a irredeemable act. Whatever it is, sure, that's true. But he has to live with it in this life for the rest of his life.
With the murderer Andy Rodriguez behind bars, the victim's family have to try and put some sense back into their lives.
There's no winners in this. Your loved one isn't coming back. So when I say that you bring them a little bit of closure, a lot of people exaggerate it. Well, now at least there's never going to be closure for that family. They're going to miss their loved one every second for the rest of their lives. But at least legally, they don't have to worry about that person being out free. They don't have to worry about that person hurting anybody else. That part of it they can put to the side, and they can now, what I consider will be, and I'm not a psychologist, they can finish the grieving process now.
The victim's family, the subject's family, anyone closely associated never forgets about a human tragedy like this. And really, it was a human tragedy.
And then they'll stay in contact with you for years. And one day, it just stops. And that to me tells me that they're at a place at least where they don't need to hear my voice anymore. They don't need to hear the reinforcement from me that everything's fine, that he's still in prison, he's not getting out, there's no appeals, and it's a process they go through.
The tragedy of this whole incident is the lack of change within society.
I don't think it changed anything. I honestly don't. It's unfortunate, but I don't think it changed much. These are still young people. They're still going to have passions. They're still going to be immature. And crimes like these, unfortunately, will continue to occur.
People will always be hotheads. Kids will always be hotheads. I don't know, maybe I'm pessimistic about the human condition. And I tend to think that these things will always happen. But, you know, fights like this and disrespect and that sort of, you know, the macho bumping of the elbows and why are you looking at me bad? I mean, I don't know. I've been covering it since I got here 20 years ago, and I think I'll always cover it. And the settings just kind of change and the dynamics change.
A lot of these young people don't process the way we did maybe when I was younger. They're processing things differently now, and many times it's erupting in a violent, cathartic way for them maybe. But, you know, unfortunately, whether it's a knife or a gun or, you know, the fist fights, you don't hear about fist fights anymore. It's all involving weapons now. It's either going to be a knife or a gun, and then ends up, you know, ending people's lives. You end up killing people. And, you know, I think we need to be more involved as far as reporting things and you know, and diffusing situations.
December 1994, Catasauqua, Pennsylvania. A woman and her infant son are reported missing.
He called the police and he said, something is wrong, his wife is missing.
Their disappearance sends shock throughout the community.
Everyone is easily able to identify with a situation like this and kind of put their own family in their shoes.
There was some worry that she had been kidnapped or killed and that there was a killer out there. So there was some fear in the community.
4 months later, and their bodies are discovered in rural woodlands, brutally murdered.
The cause of death for Joanna was a gunshot to the face, to her head. And they could tell that it was a .22 caliber bullet.
When the police finally identify the suspected killer, they deny all knowledge.
She professed her innocence, and she made the case that she had done good things in life.
The fact that she had lied about owning a gun, the fact that she had no alibi that stood up.
This is the heart-wrenching story of Joanne and Alex Katrinak, their terrifying disappearance, and what fueled their killer to commit such a murder.
The jealousy was so great that this became the motive for murder.
Catasauqua is a picturesque city and historic steel town in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania.
Catasauqua is a diverse community. We have approximately 6,700 people. We're 1.3 square miles, and we're bordered by Lehigh Valley International Airport, the city of Allentown, Whitehall Township, and to the north, North Catasauqua Borough. We do have our share of crime, but not so much violent crime.
On December 15th, 1994, Andy Katranak arrives home to an empty house. Unexpectedly, his wife Joanne and baby are not there.
He came home, I believe he noticed that preparations had started for dinner. There was some chicken out, but she wasn't home. He thought she might have been home already, and she was not. He waited a little while, and I believe it was around 8:30, he started to get more and more concerned she wasn't home yet, and called his mother. She was actually supposed to meet his mother earlier in the day to go Christmas shopping. And his mother said that Joanna had never shown up.
You can imagine what's going through this poor man's mind at the time. He works hard all day. He's been doing that for a while, working on some friend's home about 10 miles from home. In the days before cell phones, he hasn't been in touch with his wife or his baby, who was 4 months old, by the way, all day long. Gets home. She's supposed to be home. He knows that she's gone shopping. So at first he's thinking, oh, maybe she was held up shopping. Things are not so startling to him at that time that he sits down. I believe he has a beer. Maybe he looks at the paper. But then he starts getting worried, and he starts going through the house. And he goes down to the basement, and he sees this basement door, this old basement door that they never used, is ajar, and the hinge on it has been broken. You know, amazingly though, he doesn't immediately think break-in, kidnapping. He thinks kids, teenagers. He doesn't think that someone has really done anything, because he can't find anything amiss in his house. Nothing seems to be taken. Everything seems to be in its own place.
But as time passes, Andy grows concerned and contacts the police.
When Andy called the police about 10:30 that night, he reported that the back door down to a basement area had been left ajar or broken into.
I just talked to Allentown Police, and they told me to call you guys. I live in Caddy on Front Street.
Okay.
So, and my wife and my baby have been missing since like 2 o'clock this afternoon. And we just discovered that the downstairs basement door was jimmied open. And that's really got us worried now.
The trouble with police, no matter where they are, if they're in small town Americana or if they're in a large big city, there are so many incidents of missing persons that when a man calls, "Where is my wife? She was supposed to be with my mother-in-law to go shopping. It's now 10:30 at night and she is not home." Well, this is just another missing person. This is just another situation. The police generally do not get all that concerned.
Officers eventually respond to Andy Katranak's house to follow up on the call.
So an officer responded to that 911 call, went to the address on Front Street, and started his initial investigation. He discovered a hasp on one of the doors had been broken, and he also discovered some phone lines were cut.
With police starting their investigation, they receive a second call, this time from Joanne's sister.
It's now 3:30 a.m. in the morning, and Joanna still is not home. But her sister Peggy, who knows what's going on and knows that Joanna's not anywhere to be found, lives about 50 yards away from McCarthy's bar, and she sees Joanna's car, a tan Toyota, in the parking lot. There's nobody in the car. It's locked. They call the police.
County 911, do you have an emergency?
Yes, my sister, Joanne Kaczynuk, has a missing persons out on her. We're at 740 Front Street, and we just located her car next door.
Next door?
Yeah, but she's not anywhere to be found still.
Joanne's sister does make the call to the police. Now we found Joanne's car, and amazingly, we found it in a place where she's never parked before. She had her usual parking spots. We're all creatures of habits, and hers, not unlikely, was right behind the house where they had a parking area. Also, the car was backed in, and Angie knew that Joanne had a phobia about backing her car. She would work as hard as she could to avoid having to put that car in reverse. So now they call the police, and the police are out here again at the car.
The police come to the scene. They get into the car. They find the seat has been pushed way up close to the driver's wheel. That doesn't make sense to anybody. It doesn't make sense to Peggy. It doesn't make sense to Andy. The police start to look in the car, and they find blonde hairs that look that they're covered with blood. That doesn't make sense. There's a can of mace in the back seat of the car, and there's no baby paraphernalia. Wait a second. This is a mother who has a baby. There should be baby bags, diapers, bottles. Nothing's there.
I'd be looking at how many miles may have been put on that car since the time it was last filled. We'd do an investigation as to when the car was filled last. The hair from a dark-haired woman, why there would be light hair in that car would be a question to me. And why would there be mace in there?
Police start to suspect something sinister has happened and start examining Joanne's background and home life.
Common in missing persons cases, police will come out and take a report, but particularly with an adult, they're not going to be overly concerned right away. When they start to look into it, when they start to believe there's something more sinister going on, the people closest to the victim are usually very early on seen as suspects. And so it's not unusual to look at the husband, the boyfriend, or even an ex.
Well, the first thing they're going to look at is look at the family members. Find out what the relationship would be between the husband and wife, what the relationship is in the family, and find out if there are any issues. That's the first place to start. Joanne was 24 years old, had been in a previous relationship that resolved with some domestic violence, and she was quite younger than Andy, about 14 years younger than Andy.
Joanne, according to her family and friends, was really living a life of Camelot. But here she was with a 38-year-old man, 14 years her senior. She had a new baby. All indications from friends were that she was extremely, extremely happy.
Andy was athletic. He was strong. He was tall. He was, well, Joanne said he was everything.
But investigators know that appearances can be deceptive and start to check out Andy's alibi and other possible reasons for her disappearance.
So often the husband is an early suspect in one of these cases. Police also thought that Joanne might have fled on her own. And thirdly, there was an ex-husband as well.
In December 1994, police in Catasauqua, a borough of Lehigh County in Pennsylvania, are investigating the mysterious disappearance of 26-year-old Joanne Kaczynuk and her 4-month-old baby Alex. Police start looking to the alibi of her husband, Andy.
Police have a set, pat view of life as to who is responsible for criminality. The husband is always somebody who is a suspect. The ex-husband is always a suspect. And they look at these people because it turns out that most of the time there is some involvement that they can find by doing this search of the usual suspects. Well, in this case, Andy was viewed as a usual suspect, and they wanted to know, the police wanted to know about him. Well, his alibi and his whereabouts were rock solid.
They're going to try and determine what his alibi was, what he was doing, what he might know about what happened. For Andy, he was working at a friend's house that day, doing some contract work. His father was with him for part of the day, and I believe the friend, the person that he was working for, came home and spent part of the day working with him as well.
Joanne's family are also insistent that Andy has nothing to do with their disappearance.
Joanne's family were 100% behind him. Joanne's mother said, "There's just no way Andy could have harmed Joanne. I see them. I babysat for them. I see how they relate to each other. They loved each other. There's just no animosity between the two of them. There's no motive." As you know, a husband is always the first suspect when a wife disappears. And so he was looked at really carefully by the state police. But one of the things that dropped him as a suspect was what the parents, Joanne's parents, were saying about his relationship with their daughter.
With the clock ticking, the state police, who have joined the investigation, decide to re-examine the Katrinak's home and Joanne's car.
State police secured the residence, processed the house, and also processed the car. Doing a good investigation and checking every possible lead is the best thing that you can do.
They wanted to examine the house again. They looked for fingerprints. They examined the door. The cut phone line had already been repaired, but they wanted to look at that area as well. And Joanne's car was taken to be searched and looked through for evidence. As far as entry into the home, police found the attempts to remove screws from the door and from a window. They didn't believe that anyone got in through the window, and the door seemed to be damaged.
A few things that they did discover, and one of the things which is underrated, is they discovered no fingerprints of any note. There were some fingerprints found on some objects in the car, but there were no fingerprints on any of the portions of the car that a driver would have touched, like the steering wheel or the gear shift or anything like that. That becomes important later on when I can make the argument that someone wiped that car down. Someone tried to hide the evidence in that car. What they do find, though, is someone who tried to wipe that car down missed. They found a tiny spot on the backrest of the driver's seat where there were 6 long, dirty blonde hairs. Along with that, and attached to that, they found very, very minute traces of blood on the backrest of that car in the same spot where the hairs were. And then later on, it subsequently was determined that the blood had been on the hair and therefore got onto the backrest from the hair.
The thing to remember about 1993 is that DNA was just about to become a popular item, but it wasn't widely used. Common tools police used at the time were fingerprints and serology, blood typing.
Investigators are starting to run out of other leads.
So one of the reasons why police started to move away from the theory that Joanne had simply run away. There was no usage on her credit cards. She wasn't accessing her bank, and she hadn't taken much with her. The only items that were really missing were her purse and the diaper bag. And family members said to police if she was going somewhere, she would have taken more than just that.
Reports of a missing woman and baby sends panic through the local community, and police start being inundated with calls and leads.
Nobody disappears in Chautauqua in Pennsylvania. It just isn't happening. But in this case, there now was a missing person.
It always hits close to home when a member of the community, something like that happens to them, if they would go missing. Sometimes it all depends on what the circumstances are, whether the family isn't getting along, but most of the time when somebody goes missing, it's a concern to everybody.
Given the fact that it wasn't just Joanne that was missing, it was also a baby, a young child, just new to the world, it really stirs the heartstrings, particularly given the time of year, Christmas. It's a time people are thinking of family, thinking of one another, and to hear that his family is being torn apart. With a missing child, a community like Catasauqua or throughout the Lehigh Valley, we're talking about a lot of families, a lot of grandparents, Everyone is easily able to identify with a situation like this and kind of put their own family in their shoes. So when they see the posters go up, they learn that a baby is missing, that a mother is missing, it really stirs the heartstrings, and oftentimes it leads to a lot of tips. Police receive more tips than you can imagine, and oftentimes they lead in a lot of different directions. Sometimes they don't help at all.
There were all kinds of reports. This happens every time there's a case. There's some people who want to inject themselves into the case, who want to become important by thinking they've seen something that's vital. In this case, I call them my rejects. There were about 30 to 50 police reports, and they even had the FBI in the early days follow up on some of it. There was a report that she was seen in the airport. A young woman was seen with a child. There was another woman who's insistent to this day that she saw Joanne and Alex in a grocery store buying $100 worth of groceries with a tall, strange man that was with them. There was people who allegedly saw her on the railroad tracks.
The police start getting all kinds of reports, and those reports are often misleading. So difficult for the police to have all these strange reports. Oh, I saw her driving down the street. No, I saw her at the airport, came in a report. Oh no, she was at the store just yesterday. These are things which complicate the police's life. They don't know what to think. Is this just a young woman who has had it and gone off on her own, who ran away and went to the airport? Or is this a serious problem? This kind of thing confounds law enforcement. It happens all the time, and it's a dirty, rotten shame, particularly in this case.
The search continues, but Joanne and her young son Alex have simply disappeared. Finally, 4 months later, on April 9th, 1995, the police make a breakthrough.
4 months have passed, and there still is no trace of Joanna. Nobody knows where she is. Everyone now is resigned to the reality that this young woman, beautiful mother of a brand new baby, is probably no longer with us. There's a Paul Kovacek who's in his tractor. He's a farmer. He's plowing his field, and he sees in the field clothing. It's April, so he's doing his spring plowing. And he says, gee, what is that? And he gets out of his tractor and he goes and he looks and he finds skeletal remains. He is absolutely shocked. There's clothes and there are bags and the baby things nearby, a baby rattle. And he is frightened. He calls the police, and now the whodunit really hits the fan.
April 9th, 1995. A farmer has discovered skeletal remains in woodland in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. The remains are believed to be those of Joanne Katrinak and her 4-month-old son Alex, who have been missing since December 15th, 1994.
The discovery of the remains is terrible news. When a community knows that somebody is missing and you hear that remains have been found right away, just horrible thoughts are going through the minds of everyone that's been following that case. What the police found was the skeletal remains of an adult female, and the child, the baby, was clutched to her chest to the point where she had the child's face had sunken into her chest a little bit. That positioning, when they turned the child over, it actually had preserved the child's features. Nearby, they found a rattle. They found some other of the belongings of Joanna and Alex. And I believe on the diaper bag there were some blonde hairs, very similar to the blonde hairs that were found in the car.
That's a huge break because it gives us so many different things. Number one, it gave us some forensic evidence. It gave us 2 hairs that we found there. It gave us a baby rattle, a baby bottle, a diaper bag with its contents, which were so important in establishing time of death to me. But more importantly, it got us the area. Who would have thought to place these bodies in this particular area. Usually, if you're just trying to get rid of someone that you killed, it's going to be along some highway, not in some remote area that you'd have to take right turn, left turn, right turn, left turn to get from Catasauqua to get to this remote field. So it gave us the area and it gave us some evidence. So that was a huge break.
An autopsy of the remains is able to tell police the cause of death, and an etymologist is called in to assist with when the murders might have taken place.
Forensic science has ways by which we tell how fast insects will invade the body to determine how long the body had been there. Literally, there are body farms where the scientists study the rate at which the body decays, and we can date the time. Well, the insect invasion here would indicate that the body was about 4 months old.
They did the autopsy that was ruled a homicide on both the child and Ms. Katranak. They also discovered that she had been shot in the head by a .22 caliber, and they also found that she had been bludgeoned numerous times with a blunt object. Well, the theory at the time was that Ms. Katranak was abducted from the residence in Catasauqua and taken out to a remote location known by the suspect and murdered.
Investigators give Andy the heartbreaking news and ask him if there is anyone that would want to hurt him or wish Joanne harm. Andy mentions a phone call that was received a few days before Joanne went missing.
While Andy was being interviewed, he relayed to police a rather odd phone call that had taken place before Joanne's disappearance. An ex-girlfriend of his had called, and Joanne had answered the phone. There was some confrontation. It was a little bit confrontational. The ex-girlfriend, Patricia Rohr, had wanted to speak to Andy, and Joanne had told her that that was not going to be possible and hung up the phone.
At this stage, investigators take Andy to the area where the bodies were found.
The police decided that they needed to take Andy on a tour of the area to see if he recognized anything or something was to ring a bell in his memory that might be helpful to them. They were driving around the Heidelberg area in Pennsylvania, and lo and behold, Andy says, "Wait a second, this is where my girlfriend Patricia used to board her horses. She would ride in this area. She knew this area very well." And the police said, we got a break. We got a break here. This ride along has created a memory, and we need to follow it up.
As they started to look at Andy and some of the statements he made, and in particular in relation to Patricia, what they discovered was the night of the disappearance, or technically early the next morning, about 3 a.m., he had tried to get in touch with Patricia, even calling her mother.
So when the state police and the FBI went to speak with Patricia Rohr, they found, she explained to them that she was suspicious of the fact that they had had a child because she didn't think that Andy was able to father a child. She explained to them that she couldn't leave her residence for any length of time, that she had gone to the feed store to get some feed for her animals, and she had gone to a tanning salon.
After speaking with Patricia a second time, much of her alibi and description of events began to unravel. The first time she had been very helpful. She had spoken to police about Andy and his relationship, questioned his paternity of the child. But during this second interview, what they realized is she didn't have receipts for any of the locations she said she had gone to, including for the animal feed. And at one point she had claimed she had gone to a salon, and on that day the salon told police they were actually closed. Another explanation that Patricia gave for her whereabouts was that she had gone to a nightclub, Cowboys nightclub. When police went to check on that claim, they discovered that attendees had to sign in to the nightclub, and yet there was no sign-in for Patricia Rohr.
Police learn more about Patricia's background.
Patricia Rohr was an old girlfriend of Andy, a live-together type relationship back from, I believe, 1985 through 1989. They broke up. Seems to me it was fairly mutual. Patricia would then contact Andy. Andy would never contact her, but he'd be friendly with her when she would contact him by telephone. In 1990, Patricia Rohr asked Andy if he would help her out. Rohr was beaten up. Andy came to her rescue, and Andy let her stay in his home in 1990, the home where Joanne was taken from, for about somewhat less than a week, sometime in 1990. That relationship with Andy, as far as Andy was, it was over. As far as Patricia is concerned, we believe that she still wanted to connect with Andy on some level.
The evidence gathered from the car and crime scene gives detectives a breakthrough in the case.
There were 6 blonde hairs in the automobile that Joanna drove, that her sister discovered in front of McCarthy's. There were hairs which were discovered on Joanna's body out in the field, which were covered with blood, as were the hairs in the car, also covered with blood. And that blood turned out to be Joanna's, or perhaps the baby's blood. They weren't able to make the positive match, but it was close enough that they could tell that it was either Joanna's or the baby's blood. And then in addition, in the bags which were found at the scene of the crime, there were more blonde hairs. Now, Patricia says, I'm not blonde. I'm a brunette. I have dark hair, you see. And when the police went to talk to her, lo and behold, her hair was dark. It wasn't blonde.
Patricia was a big horse enthusiast. About the time of the incident, Patricia was involved in a riding competition. Police looked at some photos of that competition and noticed that she had blonde hair, not the dark hair that she had when they interviewed her.
But then a photograph surfaced where she was riding in a competition in Oklahoma just a couple weeks earlier than Joanna's disappearance, and she had blonde hair. The examination of the hairs the police found is that they had been bleached blonde, and this was the connection that the police were looking for.
And once a known sample from the suspect was obtained, Patricia Rohr, we would compare the question sample from the seat back of the car to the known hair sample of Patricia Rohr microscopically, so that we could see if the characteristics were the same or different. If they're different, that's where the examination would stop. The characteristics looked enough like the question sample from the hairs found on the seat back of Joanne Katranak's car for us to proceed with a mitochondrial DNA examination of that hair and compare the mitochondrial profile of at least one of those hairs on the seat back to the known mitochondrial DNA profile of Patricia Rohr. At the end, we found that the mitochondrial DNA profile from Patricia Rohr, the known, was the same as the mitochondrial DNA profile from the hair, which can't tell us that that hair came exclusively from Patricia Rohr. But at that point, we knew we could not exclude Patricia Rohr as a source of that hair.
The things which led the police to have a strong, compelling case, one beyond a reasonable doubt, were the hairs. The DNA, the mitochondrial DNA match between those hairs found at the crime scene, found in the car, that they matched with Patricia. That really was what we will say game, set, and match. It was all over for her. But there was more. It was the lies which she told. The lies of saying, hey, I was at the Cowboy nightclub. You weren't there. Hey, I was at the salon. You weren't there. Hey, I bought feed at the grain store. Didn't have any receipts. Didn't happen. Those lies came back to absolutely haunt her. When the police went to Patricia's house and they arrested her, One of the police officers overheard Patricia saying to her newborn child, "If I had known, I wouldn't have brought you into the world if I thought I was going to be caught."
But Patricia Rohrer pleads not guilty, and the case will go to trial. On June 24, 1997, Patricia Rohrer is arrested for the murders of Joanne and Alex Katranak from December 15, 1994. The Catasauqua Police and Pennsylvania state troopers investigating the murders believe they have enough evidence against her to secure a conviction.
We have the DNA, which is clearly about 60% of our case, but we also have motive, opportunity, means, false statements, phony alibis, and behavior that's just not consistent with innocence. So based on that, I told my boss that we had enough to convict, and we filed charges against her, and she was arrested on June 24th, 1997.
When police zeroed in on Patricia and decided to make a move to arrest her, they caught part of a conversation she had with her infant child, where she said, "If I had known they were going to catch me, I would have never brought you into this world."
While preparing for trial, investigators and prosecutors learn more about Rohrer's history.
Patricia had an odd background. It wasn't so odd as to that other people of her nature, of her ilk, didn't have similar backgrounds, but the oddities here were enough that they're noteworthy. She would live in North Carolina, then she would move away, and then she would come back. She was a car salesman with a car dealership where people said she was very personable. She worked in a photography studio with her mother, and she would do photography with clients that thought she was very good at this. Then she got into trouble with neglecting her animals, and she was charged with animal abuse, which became very significant in this case because she had to have the receipts for the feed which she fed the animals, and she didn't have it. And she was with Andy for a while, and then she was not with Andy, and then she wanted to get back together with Andy. And jealousy was so critical in the motive for this murder.
The little I know is that her father did die at an early age of hers. I think she had a back injury from a car accident. She had a marriage which didn't last very long.
Even after ending her relationship with Andy ended, friends noted that she continued to talk to Andy. Multiple ex-boyfriends mentioned that sometimes she would compare them to Andy. So for her to continue to call Andy, to find out that Andy had a child with another woman, that could certainly spark an obsession or an extreme jealousy.
Patricia Rohrer's trial starts on Monday, February 9th, 1998. The prosecution bases its case on forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence, and Rohrer's obsession with Andy Katranak.
It was a powerful opening argument for the prosecution. They pointed to 8 items. They said that she had motive, she was angry over the phone call, she was looking to be in touch with Andy, she had a weapon that matched the murder weapon, she had lied to them, she was familiar with the family's home, and she was familiar with the location where the bodies were found.
I gave 8 different areas of evidence that we would be presenting, telling the jury exactly what I was going to do in the case. I also gave them, and it's standard for me, and especially in this case, I gave them a little warning about circumstantial evidence. In Pennsylvania and in most states, if not every one of them, circumstantial evidence, if strong enough, is sufficient for you to render a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, since the evidence was largely circumstantial, I really beat that and made sure that they understood that sometimes circumstantial evidence is stronger than direct evidence. I believe that she surveilled the Katranak residence from the late hours of the 12th to the early morning hours or the midday on the 15th. I believe that she saw Andy's comings and goings. I believe she learned from his comings and goings that he went early, arrived back late. I believe that she saw Joanne's comings and goings. I believe that she saw where the car was parked. She knew the house. She knew this basement. I believe that she went down to the basement door. I believe that she first tried to take some plywood off the door, and then to make it look like there was no entry. I don't believe she wanted to make it look like a forced entry, because I believe part of her thinking was this would be pretty neat if they just disappeared and Andy became a suspect, or if no one thought that it was a murder. I believe that she didn't want to do anything there, but I believe that she wanted to abduct Joanne and Alex. I have no idea if she meant to kill them right away. Maybe she wanted to get the last word with them to really give Joanne a scare. I believe that when she heard Joanne was going out, I believe that she ambushed her as Joanne was putting Alex into the car. I believe she waited until Alex was put in the car, approached Joanne as Joanne was getting into the driver's seat, had the gun drawn on her, told Joanne, get in and drive, and that she got in the back seat. I believe she had Joanne drive to the spot where she remembered that she had ridden horses back in 1989 and 1990, because that was just a perfect place for her to have her little tete-a-tete with Joanne. I believe that at some point Joanne had to know what was going to happen and maybe started to yell. I believe that Rohr punched her in the face. Joanne had a broken nose. I believe that there was a lot of blood from that. I believe that Joanne struggled. I believe that Rohr won the struggle. And I believe that Rohr shot her and then stomped her. I believe that Rohr got back into her car, changed the seat so that she could fit into it, drove back, parked the car in McCarty's after dark. She wouldn't have done it during daylight. Got back in her van, which was parked somewhere in the neighborhood, not in McCarty's, and drove back to North Carolina.
This is a case of jealousy. This is a case of where a phone call is made and a woman says to another woman, get out of my life. I am with this man now. He's not yours. This is jealousy, which seems to be one of the most ancient of motives for killing. It was something that triggered an uncontrollable rage, which resulted in shooting a woman in the face, 19 bludgeoning injuries to her body, and the death of a newborn child. Jealousy. Powerful, powerful tragedy.
Some more really good detective work is our forensics showed that the bullet that was removed from Joanne's skull could have been fired by certain types of firearms. One of them was a .22 Jennings. Other ones too, but it was circumstantial evidence they were looking for a possible .22 Jennings as the murder weapon. The death could have been caused by either the shot to the face or the blunt blows to the body. Either one separately could have been the cause of death, but blunt force and shot to face were the cause of death.
Police were never able to locate the firearm that was used to kill Joanne. They did know it was a .22 caliber handgun. An ex-boyfriend told police that Patricia did have a .22 caliber handgun. She had purchased it from a gentleman in a wheelchair.
When they discovered the body in the field and the coroner examined it, they could tell that there was a gunshot right to her face, which was the cause of her death and the fatal blow, and they could tell that it was a .22 caliber bullet, which caused her death. They're looking for somebody with a gun, a .22. They asked Patricia, do you own a gun? No, she does not have a gun, she said. Well, that turned out to be an absolute lie. The former boyfriend of Patricia said, oh, gee, we went to a garage sale and there was this guy, he was in a wheelchair and he had a .22 gun and he sold it to Patricia. But the gun was really strange because it only could do one shot and then it would jam. So all you could expect from this gun is one bullet. Well, this was a lie that trapped Patricia.
I think that $50 gun was thrown away in the nearest pond as soon as the crime was committed. I had no idea, nor did my investigators, nor did my forensic pathologist, as to what blunt instrument was used to brutally beat Joanne. I don't think we were thinking outside the box at the time.
The jury leaves to deliberate, and it is an anxious time for the prosecution and investigators.
My glass is always half empty. And so even though I thought we presented the best possible case we could, and I thought, parenthetically, that she was her own worst enemy, she convicted herself by her attempting to lie about every issue in the case. Ridiculous lies, things that made her, to anybody, look absolutely guilty. So I was pretty well convinced that she had convicted herself, but I'm always worried about what a jury is going to do. The jury was out 4 hours, came back with 2 questions, went back, half hour later, convicted her. This is after a 4-week trial. She got life in prison without possibility of parole. And, I have to say this, is that the victim's family, Joanne's parents, were against the death penalty. They told me that, and so I did not advocate for the death penalty. But it's not my call. It's the jury's call, and this is a death penalty case. It really is. I mean, the murder of a woman and a 4-month-old baby. But I left it completely in the hands of the jury, and I did telegraph to the jury that I was not requiring or asking for the death penalty. I've never been a death penalty proponent.
I was happy that our exams worked and gave the prosecutor information that could be used to help the jury make a decision about what happened in the case.
If I was going to ask Patricia one thing, it would be, was it worth the life of a mother and child?
Charlottesville, Albemarle County. The body of a female student is discovered by her roommates in their college campus apartment at the University of Virginia.
A 911 call was placed by her roommates to police because they had found her face down on her pillow in bed.
The victim has been subjected to a violent attack in her residence.
They also discovered a door with a hole kicked in.
Police arrive at the scene and quickly identify the young woman as 22-year-old Yardley Love, a senior college student just weeks away from graduation. Investigators learn that Yardley had recently broken up with her college boyfriend, a 22-year-old fellow student and athlete who already had a troublesome past.
I don't think she was afraid of him at all, but eventually the threats turned deadly.
This is the story of a jealous lover, his uncontrollable rage, and the tragic consequences it would have for the family and friends of Yardley Love.
She found the good in every soul that she met and the good in every situation she encountered. It's happening to the family next door, which is exactly what Yardley was, the girl next door.
The University of Virginia is located in the city of Charlottesville, approximately 120 miles southwest of Washington, D.C.
Charlottesville is a very genteel community and a beautiful university for some of America's brightest students.
In May 2010, this idyllic college town is rocked by the brutal death of a young female college student. Yardley Love, a 22-year-old student at the University of Virginia, is found unresponsive in her campus apartment, with clear signs of trauma following a violent struggle.
Yardley's two roommates came home and they found her face down in her bed. Initially, they just thought she was passed out. Then they saw blood and they realized something very violent had happened to her, and they called 911.
Officers from Charlottesville Police Department respond to the call and arrive at Yardley's apartment on 14th Street.
When police arrived, they saw the blood on the pillow. They saw obvious signs of a struggle. They saw the door had been kicked in, and they realized something terribly wrong had unfolded.
News of the tragedy soon reaches Yardley's family in her hometown of Cockeysville, Maryland.
It was probably 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was asleep. A policeman came to my door, and when I opened the door, they asked me if I was Yardley Love's mother. I said yes, and then I guess everything went blank after that. I don't think the policeman even had to tell me.
I was in my exam week of my last year of college, and I had actually stayed up late studying with a friend, and I was so tired, and my phone was ringing at 6 o'clock in the morning. When I answered the phone, she said that it was Katie and that I should wake one of my friends up because she had something really bad to tell me.
About 5:45, Monday morning, May 3rd. And I got a call on my phone, and it was my administrator who had told me that there had been an accident that involved Yardley and that there was a lot of blood. And I said, well, what did she hit? Like, where was she going? Was she in town? And she said, she's been beaten up, and they found her dead in her bed.
8:29 a.m. on May 3rd. One of my dearest friends was an assistant coach at UVA. She said, are you driving? I said, I'm at work. I need to tell you that Yardley Love has been murdered. And there was this silence. She said the state troopers had just been at Mrs. Love's to let her know. And we both started crying.
Police now want to learn more about Yardley's life on campus in the weeks leading up to her murder.
Police asked the roommates what they knew, and all they could say is we had come home and walked in on this. Police officers then asked who could have done this, and the roommates said, George.
Yardley had been in a relationship with another student at the university, 22-year-old George Hughley, but they had recently broken up.
When the police officer said, you have any idea who would ever want to hurt her? I said, she did used to date a jerk, and his name was George, but I can't imagine that anyone that could love Yardley could do this to Yardley.
George Hughley was in his final year at the time of Yardley's death and played with the university men's lacrosse team.
Yardley lived in one building with some of her lacrosse teammates, and George lived across the parking lot in another building with some of his lacrosse teammates. There was no evidence of forced entry into Yardley's building because so often the teams just left the doors open between them.
From the start, George was way more interested in Yardley than Yardley was interested in George. The first time we talked, he told me, you have to get your best friend to like me and go out with me. And at that time, she had a boyfriend who was another one of his teammates on his lacrosse team. And I remember thinking that didn't really feel right that he was saying that, especially because it was his teammate that she was dating at the time.
I knew that Yardley started to date a guy on the lacrosse team at the beginning of her second year. They were all friends their first year, but then it actually turned into a romantic relationship at some point during her second year.
It was just so many experiences and parties and dates and being out together that he finally wore her down in a sense, and her two best friends were dating his two best friends, and so it honestly became easier for her just to sort of explore what that would be like to take their relationship from friendship to romantic.
Police very quickly knew that they needed to interview George, and they began to understand from conversations with others that the couple had had some tension, that George had made some threats.
The first time that I truly questioned him as a person was a night that we were home over a break that we were back from college, and we went out together to a bar, and then we came back and we were sleeping at my parents' house, and she hadn't been texting him back or answering his calls. I think he called her like 30 times in a row, and she just brushed it off. And I remember being so rattled by the fact that he would not stop calling her, even when she finally did answer and said, I'm at Catherine's house and we're going to bed and I'll talk to you in the morning, and that wasn't good enough. And he immediately went on this very aggressive offense where he was accusing her of, you're not at Catherine's, I know you're with a guy, and she had never done anything like that to make him think that. And I remember in the morning asking her, like, is that normal? And she was like, yeah, you know, he just gets protective and he wants to know what I'm doing all the time. And I remember that was like the first time that I started to be a little bit more concerned that he really wasn't a good person for her to be spending time with.
Investigators now want to speak to Hughley about his movements on the night of Yardley's death and bring the student in for questioning.
George said Yardley was upset. He described a confrontation. George said he had gone to her apartment, that he was trying to get her, in his words, to chill. He said that she was standing with her back against the wall and that she began bouncing her head off the wall. He said he might have grabbed her. He said he might have thrown her on the bed. He said he left her alone.
He didn't think that he had hurt her. He certainly didn't think he had killed her. He said she was alive when he left and that he could never do that, but he had been drinking heavily the day before, and his memory was not on point.
Police search George Hughley's campus apartment and uncover suspicious bloodstains in the bathroom.
I think that he slowly started to spiral out of control once she really broke up with him for the last time. I think he knew that it was done forever. I think she had made it very clear, we're graduating college, we're finally going to be separated from one another geographically, I'm not going to be forced to see you all the time, and like, this is it. I'm going to just tough it out the rest of college, even if it means missing things, because I cannot stand to be around you anymore, and this is now really unhealthy, and I don't want to be anywhere near you.
Hughley undergoes a medical examination, which reveals fresh cuts and bruising on his body.
I didn't understand the magnitude of that jealousy and that fear of what if she's not mine forever.
Hughley continues to protest his innocence in Yardley's death, but investigators now believe they have enough evidence to formally charge him with murder.
Police zeroed in on what they believed to be true, that Yardley had been the victim of a massive assault, had been injured gravely, and that George had a role in it. There were no other suspects. The DNA evidence clearly put him at the scene, and he was arrested the next day for her murder.
George Hughley is remanded in custody awaiting trial for the murder of Yardley Love, while Charlottesville and the close-knit university campus community try to come to terms with the senseless tragedy.
I couldn't tell the team what had happened until George was arrested. So we needed him in custody before we could let anyone know. I mean, people fell to the floor, the guttural pain, the shock. I remember the hugs, I remember the silence. Just being able to hear kind of the tears and the crying. Every single player that walked into the lawn room that we were in, when I said that Yardley had been hurt and that she wasn't okay,
May 2010, Charlottesville, Virginia. 22-year-old college student Yardley Love has been brutally murdered at her campus residence.
This is a murder that stunned the college community. University of Virginia and Charlottesville are not places where these sort of things are supposed to happen.
The police investigation quickly focuses in on Yardley's ex-boyfriend, George Hughley, who has a history of violent and controlling behavior.
That morning, by 9 o'clock, he was in custody and being interrogated. He didn't think that it was possible that she was dead.
Police did not consider any other suspects in her murder. And as they began to ask questions of Yardley's friends, it became apparent to police and to the friends themselves that each of them had small pieces of the story, but none of them had been successfully able to put together the puzzle that Yardley's life was in danger.
George was a very jealous person. He just had his own insecurities that made him judge and question other people. I think he wanted everyone to know that they were together, and so he had a really hard time when they weren't together, if they were both back home at their own hometowns or, out even at college doing their own thing. That usually started a fight because he would pick a fight and try and get attention, and he didn't like that she was spending time with other people. He wanted to be the center of attention, and Yardley was very independent.
Yardley's family and friends struggle to understand how they failed to see the warning signs in Hughley's behavior.
There was one incident when they were all at a party and he grabbed her, and that scared her. But that was the only time she ever mentioned that she was afraid of him, because I was going to go talk to his lacrosse coach, and she said, "Oh no, it's not that big of a deal. Don't worry about that."
I think they had stretches where the relationship was strong, and then there were stretches where Yardley couldn't really even stand to talk about him. He was driving her crazy, but because of the close-knit sense of their college community, especially as lacrosse players, she couldn't really escape him. And so she always sort of tried, I think, to find a way to make it easier for everyone and pacify the group and just go with the flow, and then they would find their way back to one another.
I'm fairly sure that most of the adults in Yardley's life have 20/20 hindsight and wish we had handled things differently or been more aggressive in terms of, separating them or getting her out of that situation.
Both Yardley and George played on the lacrosse teams for the University of Virginia and bonded initially over their love for the game. News of Yardley's death sends shockwaves through the tight-knit lacrosse community.
Our reaction was, how do we take care of our team? We let the men take care of the men's team. They were grieving the loss of Yardley as a great friend to them, not as a teammate, but they were also then like, how could one of our teammates do that to one of our friends?
It was all in. It was truly a resounding reflection of the lacrosse community and, in a larger sense, the Notre Dame prep community. Some of the younger girls on the team had older sisters that played with Yardley. There were also people who had brothers that played on the men's team at UVA. We had a big game at the end of the week. We asked Sharon. Sharon said, ask the girls what they want to do. And they said, we want to play.
The funeral that weekend is when we really saw the men's team come again. And a lot of the men's players were the pallbearers. That was huge. It was huge for me to see. I knew that they were going to be involved, but when they walked in to a packed church carrying Yardley, it was, I thought, another amazing statement from Sharon Love and from Lexi and the family that the team didn't do this to Yardley. This was George that did this to Yardley, and she wanted Yardley's friends to feel loved by her just like Yardley had loved them.
Yardley Love grew up in the city of Cockeysville, near Baltimore, Maryland, surrounded by a loving family and a close network of friends.
We had neighborhood teams everywhere. When she was 5 years old, she went and played lacrosse, which was kind of just chasing dirt on the ground. She just took to it, practiced all the time. A lot of play was bouncing lacrosse balls off the garage doors.
I met Yardley when I was 10 years old. Our older sisters actually went to the same school that we ended up going to, and they're the same year as well. So we had a similar family dynamic, and our sisters thought that we would be friends once we started at the same school. And then honestly, from the day we met, we became best friends.
I met Yardley as a middle school student. There were probably 25 spots on the team, and there were probably over 100 people trying out for those 25 spots. So for a freshman to make varsity, it's quite a feat. As a lacrosse player, she had great skills. She was on task all of the time. She was one of the first people up to the field to get warmed up and start practice.
I met Yardley at lacrosse camp. The whole team seemed to come to Charlottesville to come and play lacrosse for 3 or 4 days. Yardley came to camp full of life, always friends, but always looking out for the people that she didn't even really know, which is what I was drawn to at first. And then I started watching her play, and she was very talented.
But Yardley's sense of responsibility for her teammates and inner drive for success has its roots in an earlier family tragedy.
Losing Yardley's dad was a huge pivotal moment for her and for her family, and honestly for our friend group as a whole. Just seeing that life is short and seeing the emotional maturity that we sort of needed to pull together. And I think losing him was very, very hard for her. And I think that a big part of her drive and what really kicked her into gear was wanting to make him proud.
Yardley receives a lacrosse sports scholarship from the University of Virginia and moves to Charlottesville to begin her freshman year majoring in political science.
When Yardley was a freshman, she would come over to my co-coach, Lisa, and I, and she would thank us at the end of every practice. She would thank us at the end of class. She would thank us at the end of every game. And I'll never forget that.
Living on campus offers Yardley the opportunity to socialize and mix with players from the university men's lacrosse team. Yardley is introduced by mutual friends to fellow freshman George Hughley, an All-American lacrosse player.
I had heard of him, but I can't say that I actually knew him. We do share fields and we pass each other, and they are in helmets and pads and whatnot.
The spell that she was able to cast on so many people, he had just totally kind of fallen for her. I think for a long time she tried to keep it at a friendship because she did think he was funny and she loved to laugh. She was drawn to his sort of the character that he could be.
She was excited. It was her first real in-town college boyfriend. Her friends were dating his friends, and it just made sense. It was who she was hanging with anyway, and he had a lot of friends around him on the guys' team and on our women's team.
I didn't meet him very often because when the girls played in town, the boys played out of town.
But Hughley's larger-than-life persona fails to impress everyone he meets.
I met him once at UVA when they were both playing in Charlottesville, and he came to my house once and had dinner and spent the night. I thought he was very laid back, somewhat unambitious, and he seemed immature.
He came off as very loud and charismatic and silly. I'd noticed from the first few encounters that I had with him that he could be very hot and cold. I just thought he was a little bit too much. It was my best friend's boyfriend who we spent time together because of that reason only.
As the relationship between Yardley Love and George Hughley begins to deepen, he starts to display jealous and controlling behavior towards her.
There was more than one episode of violence witnessed by others when George had attacked Yardley. In one occasion, members of a rival lacrosse team from the University of North Carolina responded to pull George off of Yardley as he attacked her.
All of these behaviors started to really escalate and to surface as they got deeper and deeper into their relationship, and then as she was pulling out of that relationship.
George was just so good at working his way out of his bad behavior and covering up for it and almost turning it around a lot of times or making light of it and being the jokester, that he got away with so much for so long because he found his way out.
In another instance, George attacked a fellow member of his own team who had walked Yardley home.
I remember her thinking that it was so strange and she was honestly so disgusted by it. His friends were the exact same way. They would agree with everything that Yardley said and they would feel the same way about his behavior. But then he just had this way of being this jolly, funny, sweep it under the rug, it's not that serious, and he would talk everyone out slowly but surely.
Cracks begin to appear towards the end of graduation year.
They dated on and off from our second year of college through the first half of our fourth year of college, so on and off for 2 years.
George and Yardley were 2 weeks from graduation, and they had broken up. He had been obsessed with her. Police believed that while he wanted to play the field, he didn't want anyone else to have Yardley.
Really, he was running around on her behind her back and things like that. That's why she left him. And he was fine with that until she met somebody else.
That like set something off inside of him that slowly just got like deeper and deeper. And then I think he was in such a bad mental state that the inner demon within him came out and he made the worst decision of his life.
Charlottesville, Virginia, 2010. Police have arrested 22-year-old George Hughley for the murder of fellow college student and former girlfriend Yardley Love at her university campus apartment. Yardley was discovered with blunt force trauma injuries sustained during a prolonged physical attack.
Yardley losing her dad made her grow up a lot faster than the average 20-something-year-old. And so she was very easily able to like go do things on her own. She really valued her friendships with her girlfriends. Her mom and her sister she spent a ton of time with, so she was never someone that like loved having a boyfriend and wanted to just like stay in and hang out with a boyfriend. She was on the go because that was just the way she was. She was independent.
Investigators now look into Hughley's past as they build the court case against him for first-degree murder.
In the Chevy Chase community of suburban Washington where George hailed from, there were those who saw in the allegations an echo of George's own father's behavior. George and his father both had run-ins with police. Those who knew the younger George in college saw a young man who was reckless, who felt he was above the law, who felt he could get away with anything that he wanted to. And in many ways, they portrayed that as an echo of the way he was raised by his father.
Evidence of Hughley's erratic and violent behavior emerges from multiple sources.
George unfortunately had a known history of violence and of threats.
He just had a really fast temper, really compulsive, I think, like, you know, quick to fly off the handle and physical, like he had gotten in fights with other people.
As the investigation unfolds, police discover that Hughley had tried to cover his tracks after attacking Yardley.
He tried to remove the evidence. He'd taken carpets from Yardley's apartment, he'd taken laptops, perhaps to delete emails that documented their tensions and his threats. He took away a Virginia lacrosse shirt with red stains, socks, anything that had blood stains on it. Police found all this evidence in the dumpster outside the apartment. In the investigation, police were able to uncover texts and emails that he had sent threatening Yardley. In his past, there were episodes of his excessive drinking and his arrests for drinking and his punishments for drinking, much of which was unknown to the university athletic community at the University of Virginia. But it was well known among George's peers and among Yardley's friends that he was prone to violence when he drank.
Police retrace Hughley's steps on the day of Yardley's murder.
Earlier that day, George Hughley had been playing golf with his father. George and his father had been drinking all day, and they'd been seen having an argument outside of a parking garage. Later on, George went to the neighborhood bar Boylan Heights, where some of their friends had been hanging out. Yardley had been there for a little while, and then one of their mutual friends walked her home. This sparked a jealous rage by Hughley, because he was obsessed with her.
This fell in line with his personality. This wasn't like, you know, a golden boy all of a sudden has a mental breakdown. This was a lot of questionable things that he had been doing for years, and then this was the one that really actually finally got him in trouble.
Despite the overwhelming evidence linking him to the crime, Hughley continues to fight the prosecution's case against him.
George Hughley never did admit to the crime, never apologized to myself or my daughter for what he did.
The DA can only work with what the police gather. The DA will direct the police. The DA will say, we're strong in this area, we're weak in this area. So the DA always guides an investigation that police then must carry out.
On the 18th of April 2011, after a not guilty plea from Hughley, a grand jury indicts him on first-degree and felony murder charges.
It's never enough for an alleged assailant to say, "I did it." Police and prosecutors still have to go to great lengths to build a case, to collect the evidence, to collect statements, to collect the statements of others, to gather the testimony. In the same way that reporters try to look for multiple sources, police have to find multiple sources to back up what an assailant says or doesn't say. Because at any point, the assailant could change his or her mind.
On the 7th of January 2012, 5 additional charges are added against Hughley: felony murder, robbery of a residence, burglary, entering a house with intent to commit a felony, and grand larceny.
The DA was presented with a very strong case. The evidence was there, the motives were there, the testimony was there. His family brought to bear money and connections to reduce the punishment against him. Early on, one of George's attorneys told the media Ms. Love's death was not intended, but an accident with a tragic outcome.
Justice for Yardley still hangs in the balance as her family and friends prepare for the trial. Charlottesville, Virginia. Student George Hughley is awaiting trial for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, 22-year-old Yardley Love, in May 2010. Yardley was found unresponsive in her college campus apartment by her roommates.
Police asked the roommates who might have done this, and the roommates immediately pointed them to George Hughley.
Yardley never told me that she was scared of him, but Yardley was a people pleaser, and I think Yardley was so worried about worrying other people that she felt guilty making someone else take on her stress and some of her anxieties. But I know she told other people that she was scared of him.
The trial begins on the 6th of February 2012, nearly 2 years after Yardley's death.
It took 2 years to get to the trial, so when it finally did happen, it was hard coming face to face with George Hughley again.
There was no way I wasn't going to go to the trial to support her family and to be there for her still. But sitting through and having to relive the moment-to-moment playback of what happened the night that she died was awful. And having to hear like a police officer use such cold terminology or the medical examiner explain her injuries made me physically ill.
In court, the judge was very, very sensitive to the privacy of the family members. Only the worst images were shown to the jury, but not to the assembled crowd or to the media. Family did not see the visual of George's 46-minute interrogation, but they heard the audio. They heard George, they heard his anguish when he discovered that Yardley was dead. They heard him deny that he had any role in it. They heard his disbelief that her life had been taken. At one point during the interrogation, when confronted with Yardley's loss, he actually said to police, "Kill me."
Despite Hughley's history of violent and controlling behavior, there is insufficient evidence to prove he had planned to murder Yardley on the night he went over to her apartment.
Originally, he was charged with first-degree murder. The charge was dropped to second-degree murder because prosecutors didn't believe that there was any evidence that this was premeditated.
On the 22nd of February 2012, the jury finds George Hughley guilty of the second-degree murder of Yardley Love and an additional charge of grand larceny.
There did not seem to be ever any doubt that there would be a conviction in this case. Ultimately, so many of these cases do rest on convincing 12 people that someone has committed a crime.
It's a little nerve-wracking not being sure what the outcome would be. I didn't think he would get off, but I thought maybe the charges would be manslaughter or something reduced.
We actually went down for a couple days to support Sharon, and from our conversation with Sharon and from seeing how that district attorney handled it, I don't think that there was anybody that was more dedicated to making sure that Hughley was convicted than that man that handled that case, and he did a magnificent job.
The DA in this case, had enough evidence to present to jurors who made the decision that George Hughley was guilty.
You watch the whole process hoping that the jury saw it the same way we did, and they did.
On the 30th of August 2012, Hughley is sentenced at Charlottesville District Court.
Jury sentenced George to 23 years in prison for second-degree murder and 1 year for burglary.
George Hughley will get out in 5.5 years. He'll still be young. He'll still have a full life ahead of him. I hope he's changed, but I don't think he has.
With Hughley now safely behind bars, Yardley's family and friends reflect on the impact she had on the lives of everyone she met.
It seemed like everybody loved Yardley. I never heard an unkind word. You don't know really what your child does once they're not under your roof. And so when this happened, you don't know what somebody's going to say or do, or some experience that I know nothing about. But every single thing said about Yardley was so kind, and people just rallied around so much. I think she was just a really good person.
A lot of people felt that Yardley was very special, but I think it was a lot of the things that she did when no one was watching that really set her apart as a friend and a person. She didn't do the right thing for accolades. She did it because she had an amazing moral compass, and I think for her it felt good to do the right thing because that was just how she was, and that was in her DNA.
If she was your daughter, you would pat yourself on the back and say, I crushed it. I really raised an amazing young woman. She was as beautiful on the inside as on the out, and she was as good a friend as you could ever have.
The seniors, when they were going the week of prom, would get up and they would describe their dresses to each other. At the end of practice, we'd take 10 minutes and we'd say, okay, you two stand up and let's hear about your prom dresses. And of course, it was Yardley's turn, and she stood up and she used a term. I said, Yardley, I don't know what you're talking about. It sounds beautiful. I'm sure it will be beautiful on you. And she said, you know what, Miss B, I will come and show you the day of prom. I said, Yardley, you're going to have 5,000 things to do. You're not going to want to come on campus and show me your dress. I'll be there. So she left a pre-party with her dear friend, and they came in their full prom dresses to an afternoon at the prep at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when they're supposed to be off being very girly and getting ready for their prom. I was always moved by that, because nobody else was going to do that. But it meant the world to me.
Following the tragedy of her daughter's death, Yardley's mother, Sharon Love, creates a non-profit organization to raise awareness among young people of the hidden signs of domestic violence.
What connected with me more than anything was not the trial, was not the murder, but was the reaction of Yardley Love's family after the fact, to find the best things about her, to celebrate and use those as a way to empower other young women and men to be alert to the dangers that had taken Yardley's life.
We had 2 years between when Yardley was murdered and when the trial started, and it gave me time to do research. And I realized, surprisingly, that 18 to 24-year-olds are the most vulnerable group of people to domestic violence. So that was when I decided we had to do something.
One Love started with Yardley's mom and sister and all of her cousins and friends and all our coaches and teammates wanting to do something. Everyone just felt so hopeless and so devastated, and so we wanted to come together to do something. And so it started honestly as just selling t-shirts and raising money to create a turf field at our high school for the future students to play on.
The university convened a vigil drawing more than 1,500 people. The university president spoke to the assembled students and said that at no point should any woman, any student, have to fear these kinds of circumstances. It elevated the conversation about partner abuse, about domestic abuse, about awareness and red flags and things that people should be aware of. And the university took a leading role in trying to put that forward, which the family itself then followed through on.
I never thought about domestic violence in that age group ever. When I grew up, it seemed that people were married with children and trapped with no income and couldn't get out. That was my image of domestic violence.
I cannot tell you the places I've been and I see like a One Love sticker or a One Love t-shirt, and the number of people that come up to me to tell me that they participated in a workshop or that One Love saved their life or one of their friends' lives. It's definitely one of my proudest accomplishments, is being part of a movement that has made such a difference already.
They really helped. They helped kind of get it out there. This is not just happening with families that are marginalized. This is happening in a lot of different places, and we need to start to pay attention to it.
I can say in full confidence, the work the One Love Foundation has done in Yardley's honor and memory has absolutely saved lives, and it is absolutely going to continue to do just that. I'm incredibly proud and grateful for the work that's been done.
Our student body approaches their relationships differently because of the education of the One Love Foundation and because it hits so close to home. I want to say that we are adding a thread of protection for our young lives that needed to happen.
Yardley Love's legacy is commemorated at Notre Dame Preparatory High School, where a lacrosse playing field has been named in her honor.
My silver lining will always be that I taught her, I coached her. She made a huge impact on me, and I miss her every day. But while she was here, she made the world a better place, and even in her passing, she's made the world a better place.
It's always the hope when I cover a story like this that it informs and it educates, and that people, if they don't see themselves, maybe they see someone they know, and that this story is a way for people to begin looking out for others in their world.
The University of Virginia also remembers Yardley every year, in their own special way.
Every May 3rd, since 2011, the women's lacrosse team has painted Beta Bridge, which is this huge bridge that really connects kind of the central grounds over to the fraternities and sororities world. So everybody comes up and down Rugby Road, but you paint the bridge. You could paint it in 1 hour. It could be somebody could paint over it immediately. Like, people don't even let that paint dry necessarily. They write our website. They help people understand as they pass that bridge, walk on that bridge, see that bridge, take pictures of the bridge, that, you know, hey, we lost somebody really important to the university. We lost somebody who had the brightest future as of anybody. So just take a moment, go to the website, learn, and just pay attention to what we're doing.
I think every parent wants to do something to remember their child, and I would suggest that they have a place or a bench or anything that they want to start, just to have a memorial for a young person.
Thankfully, I do think that so many of these colleges have seen time and time again stories like Yardley's pop up, and they do not want to be the next campus that is under the spotlight for the most terrible reason in the world. So I think the fact that now coaches and programs are stopping to slow down to find a way to make sure that their athletes are as healthy as they can be, especially in their relationships, and trying to really arm them with curriculum and conversation and workshops that are going to make them better humans, better players, just all around better people, is so important, and it does make me feel more hopeful for the future.
I would say it's across the board, but I do think student athletes and professional athletes are certainly highlighted. So you hear that story more often. Winning isn't everything. We need to remind the kids, this is your mindset on a field and in a game, but in a relationship, it is exactly not that. If you bring that mindset off the court, off the field, and into a relationship, you're doomed.
It's always hard for me, even after covering crime stories for 20 years, to understand why certain stories take off and capture the public imagination. This one resonated for so many because these were two people from a like background, well-to-do, terrific potential. Their lives collided in unexpected ways, resulting in horrific violence and a terrible loss. So many people look at lives like these and think, well, they've got it all figured out. they've got it together. It's not going to happen to these people. And so when it does, it jerks our eyes and holds us hostage.
Can't reverse what was done, so justice is not necessarily in my vocabulary, but I think everybody did the absolute best they could, and we got the best outcome possible. But it didn't bring Yardley back.